Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for September 1st, 2022. Now, as we've been discussing in the last few days in the aftermath of the Jackson Hole, Wyoming Federal Reserve meeting, there's been a lot of discussion about the Powell comment that we're going to need pain to stop inflation. Now, this goes back to the August 2019 Jackson Hole meeting, where the idea was introduced at that time by Fink of BlackRock, Mark Carney of the Bank of England, and others, that we need a regime change in finance, which is what we've been pursuing since then. But this is not new. Many people talk today about the Agenda 2030, talk about the World Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab, as the originators of this idea of the Great Reset. What I want to do today is take you back 30 years earlier to something called Project 1980s. This was the origin of the Great Reset, and it was introduced in the Carter administration under the leadership of the Trilateral Commission, which provided much of the cabinet that served in the Carter administration. People like Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was the National Security Advisor, Treasury Secretary Michael Blumenthal, Defense Secretary Harold Brown, and importantly, Paul Volcker, who at that time became the chairman of the Federal Reserve. Remember, Volcker played a role in the 1971 August decision of Richard Nixon to end the Bretton Woods system, remove gold backing for the dollar, which led to the creation of a floating exchange rate system. Now, on November 9th, 1978, Volcker delivered something called the Fred Hirsch Lecture at Warwick University in Great Britain. Here's what he said, quote, "A controlled disintegration of the world economy is a legitimate object for the 1980s, unquote." Listen to that again. A controlled disintegration of the world economy is a legitimate object for the 1980s, unquote. He was not just speaking in some dreamy, idealist, utopian manner. He soon became chairman of the Federal Reserve, and beginning in October 1979, as inflation was galloping ahead, he began pushing interest rates up, leading to a 21.5% prime rate by 1980. Now, Jerome Powell, in his speech last Friday at Jackson Hole, warned that if the increase in interest rates that he's doing now with the Federal Reserve is not enough to stop inflation, he may have to resort to Volcker measures. Now, many people are saying, and by many people I mean some neoliberals are saying, well, this is good because the whole goal is to reduce liquidity. Now, it's true. It's necessary to take liquidity out of the speculative system as we see electricity prices soaring, food prices soaring, not as a result of Putin's military operations in Ukraine, but as a result of the flood of liquidity that was pumped into the system in the last 2.5 years. But why was that pumped into the system? It was not about production. It was not about consumption. It was about protecting the debt bubble and keeping debt on the books of banks at face value or better so that speculation could continue. It had nothing to do with economic policy. What they don't understand is that Volcker used the fight against inflation to push forward controlled disintegration. Now, what did this mean? Well, under Volcker and the period of the late 1970s, early 1980s, we had a takeoff of what is called today globalization. That is a move toward a top-down control over all aspects of the economy, including especially the financial system, with a move against sovereign nations to establish what some people call a world government. This included free market, free trade reforms, the World Trade Organization, and so on. It included deregulation of markets, including stock markets, but also bond markets and banking as a whole, culminating in the repeal of Glass-Steagall in 1999. It included a rush toward privatization. Now, they used the oil price hikes from the two oil hoaxes of the 1970s to accumulate a pool of income called petrodollars at the time, which gave the banks ample liquidity, but that never made it into the real economy. Instead, under Volcker, what we saw was massive deindustrialization, the shutting down of industry and the transformation of agriculture from family farmers to cartels. There was a collapse between 1979 and 1982 of key productive sectors in the manufacturing area. These production fell by almost 50% across the board, especially in the machine tool sector. At the same time, we had a shift toward outsourcing, that is, moving U.S. industry to Latin America, South America, China, Asia in general, the so-called supply chain. And this was through a consolidation of cartels in agriculture, in industry, in raw materials. At the same time, even as these businesses were moving their operations to other countries, we saw a massive increase in third world debt. And under the International Monetary Fund, this debt had to be repaid by slashing consumption in those countries. Now, simultaneous with this, we had a takeoff in so-called ecology, the green movement, which was at the time called the zero growth movement. And what was its goal? Well, its goal was directly related to controlled disintegration. It was depopulation, and it was built on the foundation laid in the mid-1970s by Henry A. Kissinger's National Security Study Memo 200, which identified population growth in the third world as a national security threat to the United States. This was classified for a number of years, but once it was unclassified, and by the way, we were reporting on this as it was happening, that the intent was to reduce birth rates and accelerate death rates in the poorer countries in the world as a way of reducing world population. Today, climate change is the new excuse for this policy to further tear down physical economy of efficient, energy-intense means of producing electricity and energy, a zero carbon policy to shut down industry and agriculture and food production. And what's the result of this? Well, we're seeing the likelihood of brownouts this weekend in California. We have unaffordable electricity rates throughout Europe, and we see the breakdown of infrastructure, as in the case of Jackson, Mississippi, the capital of that southern state, a city of 160,000 people, which has no fresh running water right now. The water system has broken down and is shut down, and the people of that city are depending on water being shipped in from the outside. And at the same time, we're seeing regime change wars, attacks on those countries which refuse to go along with the so-called rules-based order, because it's an attack on their nation and their sovereign right to protect the standard of living of their people. Now, the goal of controlled disintegration is to reduce the world population to between 1 or 2 billion people, as expressed by such figures as Prince Philip, his son, Prince Charles, Klaus Schwab, Mark Carney, and others. The importance of reducing population for them is key. And what are we seeing in the United States now? A reduction of life expectancy in the last 2 years of almost 2 years. That is, if people are dying 2 years earlier than they were 3 years ago as a result of both the COVID crisis, but also drugs, alcoholism, suicides, and an overall decline in the standard of living. So the question you might have is, well, why was this called controlled disintegration? Well, there's a fear. The people who are pushing this have a fear that once people figure out that they're a target of this operation, that they might rebel. And what would that form would that rebellion take? Well, if it took the form of civil wars, of breakdown into identity sectors fighting each other for a bigger piece of a shrinking pie, that would be part of what they wanted. What they fear, though, is that there will be a mobilization to return the United States to the American system and return the world to a new Bretton Woods system, which would take the best of the old Bretton Woods system and reform it by ensuring that every nation is a sovereign nation, that the money that's printed, the credit that's generated, is going into physical production, that is restoring the highest level of physical production possible, and increases in productivity based on bringing online new scientific and technological advance. That's the fear of this global elite run out of the City of London and Wall Street. Our mobilization is to have a new financial and security architecture, and to remove from power the genocidalists behind this idea of using controlled disintegration and reduction of population, both through war, regime change, and through austerity policies. This was forecast by LaRouche going back to the 1971 decision to eliminate the Bretton Woods system. But he consistently, over the last 50 years, identified this policy, the zero growth policy, the intention, the people behind it, and how to defeat it, how to reverse it. I'm going to link at the bottom of the description page today a February 2008 article by LaRouche titled, "Hyperinflation is Here, This Economic Breakdown," unquote. And that had to do with his warnings that we were about to enter into a banking collapse as a result of the mortgage-backed security bubble. From that time to the present, they've added about $30 trillion of liquidity to the financial system. And that's a low-end estimate. Much of that, in fact, over 20 trillion since the fourth quarter of 2019, when they announced the financial regime change. That's why we have inflation, and that's what we have to fight. And that's what the call for a new Bretton Woods system is all about. Tomorrow's Friday. I'll be taking your questions. Send them to me at harleysch@gmail.com.